Hi, I'm Ken. Let's take a look at the German hyperinflation stamps of the 1920s. I think I first got one of these stamps when I was 10 or 12 years old. Let's see, the exchange rate from marks to dollars back then was 2.6 marks to the dollar, so. Oh boy, I'm rich! Today I have this pile of mint stamps, each with a face value over 1,000,000 marks. You should all know that Bill Gates is my limo driver. Anyway, Germany moved from the mark to the euro in 2002, although you can still officially convert marks to euros at about 2 marks to the euro. There's a catch though. I'm casually saying mark, but the currency called the mark has changed with time. This was the currency at that time. The most recent German mark-style currency was the Deutsche Mark. Before that was the Reichsmark, and before that the Rentenmark, preceded by the Papiermark, like what I'm showing here, which came out after the plain old mark, sometimes called the German mark. These stamps are denominated in Papiermarks. The catalog shows the value of my 10 million mark stamp as 25 cents. It's considered the minimum value a dealer would have to charge to make it worth selling you a single stamp. In other words, my 10 million mark stamp is worthless. The same thing is true for each of the million mark plus stamps in this pile. Interestingly, in used condition, the 10 million mark stamp is worth about $1.50. It's the case for all these inflation-era stamps that a used copy is worth many more times than the mint copies. This is my page for the highest denominated stamps of this period. Notice that I prefer to collect these in used condition if I can. With the outbreak of World War I, Germany suspended the gold standard in an effort to pay for the war effort, thus the Papiermark. After World War I, Germany had war debts to pay and owed reparations as part of the Treaty of Versailles. As Germany printed more Papiermarks to pay those debts, its value decreased. Other countries declined to accept them as payment, so Germany started buying foreign currency with its Papiermark at any cost to pay those debts, further devaluing their Papiermark. This is a chart of the inflation of the Papiermark relative to the gold-backed mark that came out before it. Note that the value axis is logarithmic. By the end of 1923, it took 1 trillion paper marks to have the same buying power as the mark before it. That's a trillion with a T. My 10 million mark stamp came out in 1923. When this stamp came out on October 9th, the rate to mail a regular letter was 800,000 marks. The next day it would increase to 2 million marks, doubling again just 10 days later. The final postal rate during this period for mailing a regular letter would be 50 billion marks as of December 11th. The Germans used the word Milliarden for billion, hence this stamp. This is the stamp that covered the most inflated postage rate during the period of hyperinflation at the end of 1923. This stamp would cover postage using the postage rate associated with the Papiermark. On that day, though, a new currency was introduced, the Rentenmark. The stamp on the left, labeled just 5, covered the postal rate in that new currency. The denomination for that green 5-cent stamp is Pfennig. 5 pfennigs, or 5/100ths of the new Rentenmark. Still, during the entire period of hyperinflation, sending a letter was always a good deal. On this chart, the black is the relative value of the Papiermark against the gold standard mark. The blue is the cost of a regular domestic letter, and the red is a regular international letter. All during that period, the cost of a letter was less than the cost of the inflated mark, just as you might expect. To keep up with inflation, though, postal rates had to increase frequently. In November alone, there were 5 different postal rates, starting at 40 million marks and going up to 40 billion marks, a 1,000-fold increase. At the end of 1923, Germany introduced the Rentenmark in an effort to curb inflation. 1 Rentenmark was set to 1 trillion paper marks. But the Rentenmark was backed by a combination of the German gold reserves and the value of government-held property. Renten is the German word for mortgage. In essence, the Rentenmark was tied to the cost of property. Rent, if you like. The plan worked, and the German mark finally stabilized, ushering in a period of stability, even prosperity through most of the 20s, which lasted until the start of the Great Depression. Yes, the Great Depression was a global catastrophe which started in 1929. I used to think this German era of hyperinflation was the same as the Great Depression, but they're completely different events. For Germany, the Great Depression was its own crisis, which ultimately led to the rise of extremism and contributed to the start of World War II. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. Before we can talk about the higher denomination stamps, we need a little grounding in the stamps that came out before them. You'll see why in a moment. All these different stamps came out starting in 1921 with lozenge watermarks. This feels a little bit of a chaotic set to me, and it gets more chaotic as the postal rates start to go up. At least the different design types cluster together in this set. The lowest value stamps, in pfennigs, are just numbers in boxes. Next comes a series of laborers, metalworkers, miners, and farmers. Then starts a short set of mark value stamps, the post horns. There are just 3 of these to start, but you may be aware that there are more to come. Finally, we get 3 larger format, larger mark value stamps. Typically, countries use these larger format stamps for the less common postal needs, making it easier for postal workers to identify these larger value stamps on bigger items. Notice that initially there were just 2 of these larger value numbers, and finally one 20-mark stamp for what would have been considered the unusually high denomination design. It's soon to be swamped by other values, but you can tell from how this set is laid out that nobody was expecting what was about to come with these designs. When these stamps first came out, sending a local letter was just 40 pfennigs. As a result, used copies of the lower value stamps are inexpensive. Toward the end of 1921, these stamps were reissued with a webbing watermark, with the only other change being the addition of a 75 pfennig value of those number stamps. By that time, and during the life of these stamps, inflation started to kick in and the pfennig value stamps were of very little use. As a result, used pfennig values for these stamps have become quite expensive. These are my low values for these series. The top line is my stamp with the lozenge watermarks. You can see that I have all these used. The second line has my webbing watermark stamps. I just have one of the lowest values, and notably that stamp is mint. I don't know why I haven't found the other values mint yet. They aren't really expensive. After inflation started to kick in, there was a need for higher value stamps. These additions to the post-horn design came out to fill that growing need. The first 3 stamps are from the original releases, the 2, 3, and 4 mark values. These post-horn stamps came out in 2-color versions first, then later they came out in single-color versions. The second colors are surprisingly subtle, so subtle you might have a hard time seeing them in this video. They show up in the oval of letters spelling out Deutsches Reich marks. Initially, there was a 5-mark value shown on the first line, and higher values shown on the third line, 10, 20, 30, and 50 marks. The single colors came out in values from 2 to 8 marks shown on the second line, as well as 20, 30, and 40 mark values on the bottom line. But these higher values wouldn't be enough to fill the need, so these stamps were also added to the lineup. These wider stamps were meant to cover postage for larger parcels. These came out in surprisingly large values, with the highest being that 100,000 mark stamp at the end. That would be like the US putting out a $25,000 stamp. Incredible. These designs were refreshed from their previous pfennig values to mark values. Note that these were previously the ordinary postage stamp designs, and the post horns were intended to be the higher value stamp designs. These new, now mark value designs were intended for regular letter use too. As inflation gained steam, these issues came out to fill the need in 1923. These are new designs that were in use at the same time as the mark value laborer stamps, which were moving down to their now diminished role as low value issues. So I'm not showing you all these rising value stamps just to give you a history lesson. It's important to know about all these stamps so you could make more sense of the next series of stamps. Finally, it just got too hard to keep up, so the post office tried to solve that problem by surcharging existing stocks of all those stamps I just showed you. You can see the numbers on squares, the laborers, and the numbers in circles. There aren't any post-horn or wide format surcharges. I've put these images largely in order, and I haven't included all the perforation variants because they just clutter up this view. Those first stamps are denominated in thousands of marks. Some of the final stamps are denominated in millions of marks, but that last stamp is not in millions. It is for 1 milliarde marks. The plural is Milliarden. That's German for a billion. You can see that these stamps include the same surcharge values across multiple underlying stamps. That's in part because they were printed over existing stocks of old designs, which were either worthless or they already had too much stock of them. But there's something else going on that I just can't quite figure out. I've arranged the surcharge stamps under the base stamps they were printed over. Notice how the 8,000 mark stamp is printed over the green 30 Pfennig stamp, and the 5,000 mark stamp is printed over the orange 40 Pfennig stamp. That's what you'd expect. But also notice how the third row of stamps are printed over the base stamp in new colors. Apparently, the underlying stamps were reprinted in new colors and then surcharged with new values. There are no base stamps available in that light green of the 800,000 value stamps, nor are there any base stamps in light brown of those 400,000 value stamps. I can't find any information about why these base stamps would have been reprinted, or why, since they were being reprinted anyway, were there multiple base values reprinted for each of the two surcharge values. It's a mystery to me that I guess could be explained by the printing contractors doing the best they could in an otherwise chaotic period. If you know anything about this, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. I've done the same stacking for these laborer stamps. I've put the Pfennig values at the top for reference. All the surcharges are on the mark value stamps, although I'm a little surprised by that since they had more value than any overstocks of the Pfennig value versions. There isn't any evidence of reprinting of the base values of these issues. But with the circle design surcharges, we return to total chaos. There are 3 colors on the 200 and 400 mark value base stamps, and there are 4 colors on that 500 mark value base. There are 6 different surcharges with an 800,000 mark value in 3 different colors, including 4 that seem unified in that light green color we noted earlier. 800,000 marks was the regular domestic postage rate for 9 days starting October 1st, when the rate jumped to 2 million marks. 2 million marks was also surcharged on 4 different stamps. When the rate doubled 10 days later, 2 of these stamps would serve that need. Also note that the original 50 and 75,000 mark circle designs were never surcharged. Those continued to be useful denominations. But there is more chaos at that 75,000 mark rate. There are 3 other stamps surcharged with that 75,000 value, all of them on a stamp base that hadn't previously existed. That is, in order to get those surcharges, a new base stamp had to be printed. We can tell because all those are new colors for the base stamp. Then, after the base stamps were printed, they were surcharged with the 75,000 mark values. Again, but that seems nuts. Why didn't they just reprint more of the already existing 75,000 mark circle designs? Like I said, total chaos. Imagine being the postmaster trying to satisfy postage needs, but having no idea how high the rates might go, how long a value might be useful for, or when the problem might end. Chaos. This set came out in an effort to get a stabilized set of designs without surcharges. Notice how these stamps are printed in 2 steps. The base design, with the rosette, was printed without the value. The value itself was printed as a second step, which meant that the plate could be created even before the postmaster knew exactly what the rates would be. It was a clever solution. These rosette designs came out after those surcharge stamps. Note that except for the first, low-value 500,000 mark stamp, the rest are denominated in millions or milliarden of marks, so high. Prior to this design, the highest German stamp design without a surcharge was that 100,000 mark wide format stamp. That's quite a jump. By October 10th, a regular letter would cost 2 million marks to send. This set includes that 10 million mark stamp that first caught my imagination as an early stamp collector. There's no reason you can't get this whole set of stamps if you like. They catalog as a set, mint, for around $10. Of course, if you want used copies, that's going to set you back around $50. But even these stamps would get surcharged too as rates continued to rise. I've added the new surcharges to the bottom line. All these are surcharged in milliarden values, billions of marks. None of them required reprinting the base stamp, using the lower value stamps, including my 10 million mark stamp, as the base for these new billion mark stamps. Note that 5 billion marks was the local postage rate for 8 days, requiring 2 new surcharges, and 10 billion marks was the rate for another 6 days, requiring 3 surcharges. Although since there was never a 40 billion stamp value, these stamps and the 20 billion mark value would have gotten pressed into use for that rate too. Finally, on November 15th, the new Rentenmark currency was introduced. It had a conversion rate of 1 trillion to 1 against the Papiermark. But the postal rates wouldn't catch up for a few days, with 2 Papiermark rate increases before these, the first Rentenmark valued stamps were available to pay that new Rentenmark postage rate of 5 pfennigs. These stamps came out on the 1st of December. The postal rate in Papiermarks on December 1st was just 40 billion Papiermarks. With a conversion rate of 1 trillion to 1, these Papiermark stamps were still 10 pfennig less expensive than the Rentenmark postage. So on December 11th, the Papiermark postage rate was increased one last time to be in parity with the Rentenmark exchange rate, so 50 billion Papiermarks. Does anyone else know of another country that had such high denominations in their local currency? I can't think of any. Anyway, enough of the history lesson. Let's take a look at the stamps in my collection. I put the number in squares and the laborer stamps together on this page. I have a separate page for the various post horns later because I like to show the color differences in one place. I also put all the wider stamps on their own pages. We'll get there in a moment. On this page, I've got all the numbers in squares in used condition. I prefer used for German stamps for this period, although I may decide to augment this page with mint copies to better show the designs. For the laborers, I'm just missing the 100 pfennig yellow-green minors, something to keep me looking. These are the same stamps, but with the later webbing watermark. For this set, I'm missing the lower value stamps, but have the full set of the higher value laborer stamps. We've already mentioned that these lower values, particularly used, are much rarer, given that they were practically useless. On this page, I've transitioned to the mark value stamps. Those laborer stamps are now denominated in marks. I've got the whole set, but I'm still missing a few in used condition. This is also when the values in circles were introduced. I've got this whole set too, but I'm still looking for a used copy of the 75,000 mark stamp. Finally, take a look at those last 2 stamps. They're surcharged to support the Rhine and Ruhr Association Fund. There is another for the wide format plowing stamp, but I don't have that one yet. Many of you know that generally I only collect the regular issues. These are semi-postal stamps, with part of the proceeds going to that fund. In this case, 5 and 25 marks going to the postage and 100 and 500 marks going to the fund. I've added these 2 stamps here more like a footnote to my collection, reminding me that they exist in this series. I'm thinking that by the time the 100 marks could reach that fund, it was totally worthless. These are my post horn stamps gathered together. On that first line, I have the low-value lozenge stamps that go with the first series. I've tucked that 5 pfennig stamp up with the first strip just to make room for all the other stamps that go on the second strip. That second strip is the webbing watermarked stamps, but there's one more than will fit on that strip. I could have put the 2 pfennig stamp up and kept the others in order, but moving the 5 stamp up, I can now show the 2, 3, and 4 pfennig stamps aligned, and I've positioned the 5 pfennig stamp so it aligns with its one-color counterpart on the third row. All the stamps on the first 2 strips are the bicolored stamps. I'm still missing the first 2 post horn stamps with the lozenge watermark. The stamps on the last 2 strips are the single-colored stamps. There are a few variants with the stamps in this series. I have at least one of every design type, not all used, but still a good start. For the 4 pfennig, I've got the 2 color variants recognized by Scott. Yeah, I'm still using Scott for these stamps. I'll get around to switching someday. There's also an imperf variant that's known. For the 6 pfennig stamp, the normal stamp has the numbers leaning to the right. I have the variant with the numbers upright. There's also an imperfect version of this stamp. While it might look like the difference between those 2 8 pfennig stamps is the shade, it's actually the thickness of the lines and the number 8. Finally, there's a version of the 50 mark post horn that has a quatrefoil watermark. I don't have that, although mint copies aren't that expensive. Used copies are way out of my price range. I'm tempted to create another page for these stamps to pull out mint copies. I've got 2 pages of these wide format stamps. I'm showing them together because they fit the screen format better that way. You might notice that for some of these, I have 2 stamps stacked together. This is kind of an experiment in the best way to display these. The stamp on the top is the mint copy, and the stamp on the bottom is the used copy. I'm not sure about this yet. What do you think? Anyway, that 5 mark stamp and a 10 mark stamp that I don't have yet went with the first lozenge watermark set initially. The other stamps on those first two strips also have lozenge watermarks, but were released later. Looking at the bottom of the first page, you'll see the 20 mark plowing stamp. That first one is the lozenge watermark stamp that goes with the first set. The second has the webbing watermark. It goes with the stamps on the third and fourth strips. Like with the lozenge stamps, only the 5, 10, and 20 mark stamps came out with the initial denominations. All the others, including all the others on the second page, came out as inflation started to kick in. These are my pages for the surcharge stamps. Actually, just the surcharge stamps that came out before those rosettes. I've kept those surcharges with the rosettes. I'm not sure that's the best organization, but it works for now. That very first stamp is the only stamped watermarked with the lozenges. All the others on that first page and the first strip of the second page have the webbing watermark. I've sorted them by catalog number, which also happens to be first by surcharge value and then by base stamp value. I've made good progress on getting all these used. I don't think I'll bother putting together a page of these mint. So far, I'm not inspired by what feels like collecting wallpaper. That second 8,000 mark stamp on the first strip is the first oddity. It's kind of rare in any condition, and a used copy would cost thousands, so I'll stick with the mint one here. There's nothing rare about that last 75,000 stamp on the second strip. I just haven't found a used one yet. Same with that missing stamp on the third strip. It's a 250,000 surcharge that I just haven't found yet. There's also no reason I can't get copies of the missing 800s on the last two rows, at least mint copies. And finishing the series with the next page, I still need to find a used copy of the 1 Miliardi stamp. The final strip on that second page has the issues perforated with rouletting. Instead of the normal circle holes, these stamps have jagged V shapes cut to look like holes after they're torn from the sheet. All those light brown 400,000 mark stamps only come rouletted. If you want an inexpensive stamp to see that on, that's a good example. You'll need a magnifier to see it though. I have all the rouletted stamps, but the 2 million mark stamp is kind of pricey in used condition. I've grouped all the rosette stamps together. There are more of them than you might expect because they also came in both regular and rouletted perforations. I've got an example of all these stamps, although not all of them used yet. A few of them are notably expensive used, but I've managed to fall into one of them. That 20 million mark rouletted stamp used came tucked into a German stockbook I bought. It catalogs for a few $100s. It's worth checking the perfs on these stamps. On the second page, I've got these stamps in kind of the wrong order. The first strip shows the Rentenmark values, which came out after the surcharge stamps on the second strip. I might fix that someday. I am missing one of the 5 mark surcharges and 2 of the rouletted surcharges. They're not out of range to find. Finally, take a look at that 3 Pfennig stamp I've tucked at the start of the second strip. It's a misregistration error that helps show how the background of the stamp was printed in a different step than the numbers on the stamp. You can see the same misregistration on the 20 Pfennig stamp on the first row too. I think it's neat. And let's finish with this high-value stamp featuring the Cologne Cathedral. It's the only one of these building issues I have. I've actually been to this cathedral in Cologne. It's so impressive. Anyway, during hyperinflation, this stamp and one other was released. I pair them on this page with the new low-value mark buildings that came out with the introduction of the Rentenmark, although I don't have any of those stamps to show you either. And that's my collection. I can't imagine how frightening it must have been at the time to see your life savings dwindling away with inflation. Really frightening time, but it did give us a wealth of interesting stamps to collect. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this walkthrough and have gained some empathy for the people who had to go through that difficult period.